Okay, welcome back. Here we are at another episode of the Melillo Method podcast, and starting to feel our mojo, I think, a little bit here as we go along. This has been great and fun, and so the title is Everything Brain, and this episode is going to be really about everything related to brain asymmetry, because that is so important. It's so foundational, so misunderstood. And so, we really want to devote this to understanding the left and the right brain, what it does, and the realities of it as well.
Exactly. I'm kind of jealous. I don't have a cool T-shirt. I didn't get the memo today.
I can get you some. This is my, one of my John Varvatos. John, if you want to sponsor this, I wear a lot of your clothes, and it's pretty cool. But this is I'm a 70s rock guy, so. So Jimmy is, pretty big.
He's on the pantheon. He's on the Mount Rushmore of guitarists, obviously, and
definitely.
and people always want to know, like, what do you and Dr. Rob talk about when you're not talking about the brain? Like, usually it revolves around music. Usually always sending you Instagram videos from Springsteen.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, either that or we're arguing over Mets Braves.
Oh, the Mets Braves, yeah, exactly.
Or Yankees Braves.
Yankees Braves.
Yes. Yeah. So let's get into it. Let's talk about brain asymmetry. This is something that I'm really passionate about, because one of the things that drives me crazy is when somebody says, oh, isn't that brain asymmetry, the idea of the right and left brain, that's just a myth, right? That doesn't exist. Wasn't that disproven? And sometimes you get people like top neuropsychologists or neuroscientists that say that. And I scratch my head. I'm like, where does that come from? And actually, I searched it down, and I actually do know where it comes from, so we can talk about that. But all I can tell you is that is completely untrue, that the idea that the right and left brain are different and do different things, and that they develop differently, and that there's asymmetry or lateralization of functions, is one of, I think, the most foundational things in all of neuroscience. I think there's probably more research behind it than almost anything else in neuroscience. So anybody out there that thinks or says that the whole brain asymmetry thing isn't real and that that's been disproven, to me, has no idea what the heck they're talking about.
Yeah, or they say, it's just too simple of a model to explain the complexity of the brain. But when in fact, it actually does explain how amazing the human brain is, and the fact that we have these lateralizational aspects and the specificity from one hemisphere to the other. And we're not talking about these popular types of brain lists that you see on Google or we're talking about the real in-depthness and the subtleties that exist between the two sides of the brain.
Right. And, that's the whole thing. I mean, as we're going to talk about in Iain McGilchrist's book, which I think, Iain McGilchrist is a really well-known psychiatrist out of the UK, and he's written a few books now, really devoted almost essentially to brain asymmetry and its relationship not only to mental health, but really to, the world and politics and where we're moving as societies. Pretty profound stuff. And of course, a lot of it is really similar and uses similar research that I used when I wrote my textbook. So I'm very familiar with it. But, one of the things I like in his book, The Master and His Emissary, he starts off by saying he was sitting one day and he was reading a paper and he read in like a title basically that brain expert, says there's, there's no such thing as right and left brain or brain asymmetry. And he says, and I go on to continue reading the article and I realize they're talking about me. And he's like, I never said any of that. Yeah. And he's like, the idea that, yes, people misinterpret it. That, of course, both sides of the brain and the whole brain is working all the time.
Yep.
So we're not saying that. We're not saying only the right brain is doing something or only the left brain. Both are working, but they do different things. And in most cases, they do completely opposite things. One side of the brain is activating a particular function, and then we're inhibiting an opposing function, which makes sense. So they're both working, but they're doing different things. And even recently, we put something up, and somebody commented and said, well, that is not what Iain McGilchrist says. And I clearly was like, you obviously haven't actually read what he said. You maybe saw a podcast or you saw a clip on Instagram, because he says, the idea that the old pop culture where it's just really made it overly simple,
Yeah.
right brain, left brain, that it doesn't necessarily work that way, but essentially it does, right? And that, that clearly both sides of the brain do different things, and that's really, it makes sense.
Yeah, and he refers to the aspects of like where a skill might be more predominantly of like for example visual spatial. Okay, we believe it's the majority in the right brain. Doesn't mean that the left brain doesn't do a little bit aspect of it, but the majority of what gets processed from a visual spatial relationship is the right hemisphere that does that. So you're looking at these subtleties that exist between the two sides, and what we're trying to point out is that there is decades and decades and decades, and there's a quote here in his book that he just says that we're talking several decades of research that support the idea of brain asymmetry.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Just on attention alone, just on the topic of attention, which
Yeah.
we covered a couple podcasts ago.
Absolutely. I mean, brain asymmetry, the origins of it go back to the 1840s, really.
Yeah.
That there was one doctor there who was doing autopsies, and he found that there were a number of people who seemed to have normal lives. They were perfectly normal, and then they died, and then he did an autopsy and realized they only had one hemisphere. And so he was like, wow, how could that be? It must mean that each hemisphere literally is like its own independent brain, meaning each hemisphere could operate independently as a brain. And so we have two of them. And he actually said that most mental health issues then is probably where there's a conflict between them. And that's exactly right. And that was like in 1840s. And then later on, with Broca and other people in Salpierre and in Paris, when they first really documented it was with aphasia. So, and that's one of the examples I always use. If you have a stroke in the left frontal area of your brain in an area called Broca's area, Brodmann area 44, 45, you're going to get motor aphasia. If you get it in the same exact spot in the right side of the brain, you don't get aphasia. Boom, right there. Then clearly there's a lateralization of function in the brain. And that's true for a number of things, right? Like if you get Gerstmann syndrome, if you get a lesion in the left parietal lobe, at the angular gyrus, if you damage that, you have dyslexia, dyscalculia, right-left confusion, finger agnosia, right? If you do the same thing on the right, you don't get that. So, and those are just one example, and there's thousands of examples of that I could go through. And so, we know that exists. And so this is where a few years ago, because I read this article that was written by, I think, a psychologist or a neuropsychologist, and it was entitled The Myth of the Right and Left Brain. And so the way people are now. Like they read that title, and they're like, oh, it's a myth. They never read the actual article. Mm-hmm. So I got the article and read the article, and the first paragraph of the article starts off by saying, of course we know that the brain and the two hemispheres are asymmetric and that they do different things, right? So it starts off by saying, clearly we know that this obviously is there. But yet if you've never read past, even in the first paragraph, you just read the title, you think, oh, this is a myth, right? And it's crazy. But so what the whole gist of the article is that he's saying that there's no such thing as really right and left personality traits. He doesn't think the idea of being a right brain or left brain dominant person isn't real. And the reason why is he went to one article from the University of Utah, which did this computational neuroscience model, and they looked at brains, and they wanted to say basically, can we look at differences between the left and right brain that would basically explain differences in their personality or behavior? And from that article, they basically said, we can't see any differences in the brain. We didn't measure any differences between the right and left brain, which would correlate with these different types of behaviors or personality traits. So therefore, in that, they kind of concluded that the right and left brain thing probably wasn't a thing. But really what they were saying was, we didn't measure it. Doesn't mean it's not there. And that's the point. And so really, when you look at this whole idea of this myth of the right and left brain, it goes to that article and to that paper. And I can tell you that paper is very flawed in that there isn't sensitivity enough to pick up the differences. We don't have ways of really measuring the brain in that detail yet, in that resolution, to be able to pick up the subtle differences. But if you look at behavior and you measure things behaviorally, like looking at people and understanding what the right and left brain does, it's really in short order, it becomes very obvious that that's the way it works. And the analogy I look at is that, for the most part, if you did a computational analysis of the brain and said that, if you started out with the premise that the idea of being right-handed or left-handed is a myth, doesn't exist. Why? Because we did computational neuroscience, and we did this model to be able to see if we could accurately identify by computer models, looking at brain activity, who would be right-handed and who would be left-handed. What would happen is you wouldn't measure it, and it wouldn't be there, and they would say, well, then, therefore, the idea of being right-hand or left-hand dominant doesn't exist. But we know it does. So what does that mean? It means that just because you can't measure it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means your measurement isn't accurate enough. But when you ask somebody, are they right-handed or left-handed, or you hand them something or you get them to write, they use one hand or the other. And so that's the proof. The proof is there. And so that's it. The proof is in, you talk to people, you look at the way they see the world, and even the way they describe themselves. Someone will say, well, I'm a very logical person, and I like things neat and order, and I like to take things one step at a time, and that's the way I look at things, and I like to read. And then you have other people that are like, oh man, I see everything all at once. I like the big picture. I'm a big picture person. I like to move my body. I'm kind of more spatial type person. They're describing these differences, and they don't even know it. But that's what they're describing, these anatomical differences in the right and left brain that lead to functional differences, and they do show up in personality, and they are right and left brain personalities, and absolutely, that's there.
Yeah, and what you said about the idea that the left and right brain perceive the world differently, and Iain's talking about that from The Master and Emissary to his new volume of book, that again, if you're relying on the left brain, the left brain's going to have this very narrow viewpoint, this very logical viewpoint, where the right brain is really going to try to look at this big global aspect, and that the left brain really is not capable of looking at everything from a global standpoint. And if you were to damage, there are so many examples in the early chapters of this book where he talks about the different functions that are lost when you damage the right side of the brain as opposed to the left side of the brain. Okay, that he talks about how if you have a stroke in the left side of the brain, you actually recover better than you do if you have a stroke in the right side of the brain, and the different various dysfunctions that happen from that.
Yeah, and that's why I love that video by Jill Bolte Taylor also. She was a neuroscientist from Harvard, and she wrote a book called
The Stroke of Insight.
Stroke of Insight, and she has a great, still today, it's one of my favorite TED Talks, and I use it in my class all the time, where she suffered a stroke in the left side of her brain. And, so she was a classically trained neuroscientist and probably didn't really believe the right brain, left brain thing or whatever, but then she had a stroke in the left side of her brain. And there was huge differences in what happened to her, what she experienced, what she was able to do. She immediately got what you would look at as dyslexia. She couldn't recognize symbols or letters. She couldn't speak. She lost her ability to speak. But yet she also was able to feel like her whole body was expansive. And so she came to the same conclusion, that basically there are two sides of the brain that really do completely different things. And that normally we perceive them as integrated because that's the way it's supposed to work, where they're supposed to work together, each contributing to different aspects of it. But if anything alters that, then we see that one side takes over and the other side is deficient, and then we can see clearly that they have different ways that they operate and see the world and the schema in which we perceive things.
So one of the things I wanted to do here was just take some quotes from the book, or just some lines from the book, and because as I was reading through this, I just felt like I was sitting in one of your seminars and listening to you. And so, again, to prove the point that you're not making this up, because there's some, early criticism was, oh, that's just Dr. Melillo, the chiropractor, just saying these things, as opposed to, the neuroscientist that you are, looking at all this research that's on brain asymmetry. That's, like you said, it's been around hundreds and hundreds of years, and we've only refined it over the last, say, 30, 40 years because of all the brain imaging research that's come out. So a couple ones that just jump off, top of the head.
So just identify this book.
Yes. So the book is The Matter with Things: Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World by Iain McGilchrist. And this is just volume 1.
Right.
Okay, and the second volume, and it's actually the same book,
right.
In terms of the name of the book. Okay, so why don't we talk about, first one I think is always a big one, is the right hemisphere is essential for theory of mind, is to say that is the better able to understand another's point of view.
Yeah, which is very important, which for many people, if you know, that is one of the core features that we see in autism, is that they often may not have theory of mind or the ability to understand what other people are thinking and take another person's perspective, right? So taking that person's perspective, not just figuring out what they're thinking, but literally to go into their mind and think, what are they thinking? And that ability is really foundational to social nonverbal communication, which is really one of the main jobs of the right brain, is to nonverbally communicate. And the way we take somebody else's perspective is really we read their body posture, their facial expression, their tone of voice, all of those things, and then we actually mimic it with our body, and then we actually say, okay, I know what they're feeling because this is what I would feel, and that's how we take their perspective. And so we know that many people with right brain deficiencies or delays or injuries, they can't do that very well. They really struggle with that. And so, again, this is a right brain function, and there's both things happening at the same time. The left brain is contributing in other ways to prevent us from looking at other things, but that is, and he goes and states that in there, and that's, a clear thing. And we know that that's often associated with also what we call joint attention or eye contact. We know that people may not look you in the eye, or if we have kids that can't look people in the eye, or pointing, being able to point and joint attention is related to that. And we know that joint attention also comes from basically the right inferior frontal gyrus, and that's generated from that area. So it's literally not only just right and left hemisphere, there are specific areas of that brain that actually contribute to that function.
And Alan Shore talks about this in his book where, the theory of mind develops early on, and it's that aspect of that right brain resonance that should exist between the infant and the mother, and the fact that the infant's right brain is really trying to read mostly the left side of space, of the left side of the face of the mother, or even how the mother is holding the child, and mostly holding the child on their left side, so that way now their right brain is communicating to their right brain.
Yep. Yeah. So that asymmetry of it, and that speaks to, why do we have a right brain and a left brain? How does it get that way? And that we wrote a paper last year in a journal called Symmetry, and about the evolutionary significance and where it comes from and everything. And that could be a whole podcast in and of itself. But suffice to say that there are some genes that we know of that create a little bit of right and left brain asymmetry. But for the most part, when we look at the brain, this is another thing that people, in a simple way, will look at it. They'll say, when we look at the right and left brain, they really look anatomically almost the same on a cellular level, right? So that there aren't like different right brain cells and left brain cells. And so from a standpoint, certain areas might be larger on one side than the other, but it gets that way because of what we call non-genetic factors, meaning how we interact with the world during different stages of development determine what the right brain becomes good at and what it responds to, and then the left brain. And the way that works is that the right brain is developing in the womb, and for the first 2 to 3 years of life, it is taking the lead. Both sides of the brain are growing. The right brain takes the lead by about 20 or 30%, so it's a little bit more active. So anything that's happening during that stage is going to be responded first by the right brain, and also we're going to take action on it. And so it shapes the right brain. The left brain also responds, but the right brain takes the lead, and it does it faster. And then after 3 years, now the left brain kicks in, and now the next 3 years is the left brain is more dominant. And so as things are happening, it's coming into both sides of the brain, and both sides of the brain are responding, but the left side is doing it faster and quicker and more efficiently, becomes better at it, and then over time, this leads to subtle differences in the first 6 years between the right and left brain. But once they have an advantage to do certain things, and they do that more and more and more, that advantage grows, and each side starts to become more and more and more and more different. And that is one of the greatest advantages of the human brain. And we know, this is very well documented, that humans have the most lateralized and the most asymmetric brain on the planet. And obviously we're the most intelligent animals. And there's a relationship there. There's a great advantage there. So to say that it isn't there and that we don't have, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
So another point he makes is the idea that, or the fact that the right hemisphere is about emotional receptivity and expressivity.
Yeah, so when we talk about both sides of the brain have emotions and, respond to emotions and regulate emotions, but the right brain and left brain have emphasis on different emotions, right? So, we really should just go real quickly, just kind of in a little bit of left brain, right brain, so that people can understand this a little bit. So right brain starts first, as we said. It takes the lead. And so the first job of the brain and the right brain is that we must survive. We got to live, right? And so the right brain from the very beginning is really driven towards what we call withdrawal behavior. It's going to protect us and be safe, and it's going to do whatever it takes for make us survive. So the number one survival strategy for humans, the reason why we've been around all these millennia, is because we are social. We get together in groups. We work together. So we must be part of a group to survive. You couldn't be in the Stone Age for any length of time, walking on a savanna or through a wood or whatever, by yourself. You would be killed by another animal or other people. So you need to be part of a group. And so right from the very beginning, attachment is what drives that right brain development and everything around that. So we must attach to our parents right from the very beginning. So like you said, that eye contact we know between the mother or the caregiver and the child within the first month, it can actually be registered. And we know that there's this nonverbal conversation and communication that's happening right from the very beginning. And that back and forth is huge. And so right from the beginning, that starts to shape the right brain. The right brain is, feeding on that and developing that relationship and, reading the mother's emotions and her facial expression. And she's training this in the child by, the mothers immediately adopt what's called mother ease, which is basically a certain way of speaking to a child where they are using, high-pitched frequencies. They're going, "Hi, how are you? You're so cute." And the baby responds to that. And it really is training their temporal lobe to be able to pick up on those cues and the way
intonation and the prosodity.
Right, and the emotionality.
And it's like a slow process too. It's not like you're speaking when the mother ease is you're speaking at a slower tempo. It's not a very rapid tempo either.
Right. And they're exaggerating their facial expressions. Yeah. So as Shore talks about, there's a visual aspect to the right brain and its interaction, recognizing facial expressions and emotions and eye movements. There's a prosodity where we're hearing tone of voice, and then there's a tactile gestural. So using body gestures, touching, stroking, all of those things that are really bombarding that right brain to really develop that attachment early on. And then a child, from the time they're a toddler, should be driven to then attach with other children, their siblings and their other children, and they should go up to them. And this is all happening in the first 3 years when we're not forming conscious memories. So none of us remember doing this or learning this, because before that we all have what's called childhood amnesia. We don't form conscious memories with the right brain. We don't really start forming conscious memories until the left brain comes online. But we are learning how to interact, how to, parents will say either with kids, let's say on the spectrum, that they had no interest in other children and they just preferred to be by themselves from the very beginning. They didn't go up to other children, didn't play with them, which again is supposed to be primary. Or if they did it, they didn't pick up on how to do it. They weren't reading the social cues. And why not? Because literally there's a part of your brain that reads that. It reads facial expression, tone of voice, body gestures, tactile information, visual information.
Yeah, and Short talks about that interface between the right temporal parietal occipital junction, that TPO on the right-hand side, where, like you said, that the auditory input that's coming in and developing the temporal lobe, and then you have the visual input that's coming in and developing the occipital lobe, and then you have the somatosensory input that we've spoken about on the proprioceptive base aspect, and the vestibular input that's coming into the insular cortex, and developing that whole relationship of the TPO and the insular cortex.
Right, and so perfect example of that in when we look at brain asymmetry is the left brain. There's an area in the parietal temporal lobe called Wernicke's area. Known about it forever, again, just like Broca's area. And, there's no argument. And if you get damage there, you get receptive aphasia, meaning that if you damage that part of your brain, you can't understand verbal words. So you don't understand the meaning of words, right? So verbal understanding and communication and of that same area on the right side, the exact same three areas, right? Broadband area 39, 40, and 22 is for nonverbal understanding, where we understand nonverbal communication, facial expression, tone of voice, body gestures. So you have the right side of the brain and the left side doing similar things. Both those areas, it's about understanding communication. But the right brain takes the lead for understanding nonverbal communication. The left is verbal. Now, we all know that basically you're not going to have a really good, complete conversation unless both of those are happening at the same time, right? So you're going to, listen to the words that someone's saying, but then you're going to also listen to their facial expression, their tone of voice, what their body's telling you. It's like, I think many, guys and husbands have heard this statement where they, someone may say to you, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. Yeah. And that was offensive to me. And it's like, okay, well, the words are the left brain, and how you said it was the right brain. And both of those come together, and both of those are important. And most people would probably say that how you say it is more important than the words you say. And we know that there are people, let's say, on the spectrum that are very literal, meaning they only hear the words and they don't hear the other stuff. And that's where they may misinterpret it, because if it's a joke, if it's a question. I remember I had this guy who's 24 years old, I think he was, and he was on the autism spectrum, and he was a really nice kid. And he came in once, and then he came in the second time, and he had told me that he worked at Bennigan's. And so he came in, and I was talking to him, and I said to him, you going to work now? Just like that. You going to work now? And he looked at me, and he was confused. And he said, I am? And I went, well, what kind of answer is that? And then I thought about it. If you just took the words I said, you're going to work now. Now, the only thing that made it a question was I went, you're going to work now?
The inflection, yeah.
And he just heard the words.
Yeah.
So his answer to me was appropriate. He said, I am? Because he took it as a command. You're going to work now. And he said, I am? I didn't think I was. And he didn't hear it. He didn't hear it. He didn't see my facial expression. He only heard the words. And that was a perfect example of how it works in real time.
So when we're looking at these different relationships of the right brain, one of the other key relationships is the body image. And the idea that the right brain allows us to really have a schema of our whole body.
Right. So right from the very beginning, as part of survival and part of attachment, a baby needs to be able to tell a parent when they're in pain, when they're cold, when they're hot, when they're hungry, when they're thirsty, when they need to be changed, when they're tired, and sense of smell and taste are intimately involved with that. So we know that this is online from the very beginning, and this is key to survival. It's also, key to what will be connecting to our own body. So this is what we call interoception. And interoception is developing primarily in the right insula and anterior cingulate area of the brain. And it is where we connect to our own bodies, where we feel our body, where we understand what we're feeling. And, that is used to ultimately superimpose certain emotions on top of that, right brain emotions. And then that is used to read emotions on other people. And again, that is all the foundation of nonverbal communication. And we know that many people with right brain developmental delays have, significant alteration of their interoception, their ability to perceive their body. We know that's intimately related to the vestibular sense. We know it's also intimately involved with empathy and with theory of mind, and all of those things. They all go together.
And it's great that you bring that up, because here he has the right hemisphere is essential for empathy.
Yeah.
Okay. He has the right hemisphere is superior at reading body language and emotions expressed in the face or voice.
Yeah, and that's important. And in the neurodivergent movement, it's important because it's good. It's good that we're understanding this. But so if we say something like, well, people on the autism spectrum may not understand empathy at the same level, and they may be upset or say, no, because it almost sounds like we're criticizing them and saying, well, they're not empathetic people, or that's not what we mean at all. The fact is, and it in various degrees. I mean, there are some people that can actually read other people pretty well. But the bottom line is, if you don't feel pain, right? So if you don't have interoception, if you don't feel pain, you can't understand somebody else's pain. I mean, I had one kid from California that he literally broke his arm. I mean, he literally broke his humerus in half. Probably nothing more painful that you could ever possibly imagine. And the father said to me when the ambulance came to pick him up, they could not believe the kid wasn't crying. He wasn't showing any signs of pain. And they were like, how can he not be in horrible pain? And so if you don't feel pain, or if you feel it to a lesser degree, you're not going to be able to take somebody else's perspective and understand their pain. You're not. And that's empathy. That's the definition of it, right? So, it doesn't mean it's not we're not looking at it as a personality flaw that they're, callous people and they don't care. No, it's just empathy is a product of the brain, and it's built primarily in the right side of the brain, and it's related to how we feel our own body.
And the other primary emotions of the right brain are like disgust, sadness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you've also touched on the idea of rejection sensitivity.
Right. So again, for survival, we said that smell and taste is intimately involved with the right brain early on, and that's with babies. Obviously, taste and smell are really important, some of the most important senses early on. And we know that the most sophisticated social area of the brain, called the orbital frontal cortex, in other mammals, they're primarily built on smell. And so the basis of our social networks is really built on the sense of smell, and taste is very important. We know, again, that's altered in people that often have developmental delays of the brain. And so, many of these early senses are related to that. And, this is where we use a lot of this information, and we know there's things like pheromones and that, if we look at how animals socialize with one another. So the social part of our brain is also that right side of the brain. And again, this is really critical to survival, to getting along with other people and reading them.
So one of the other things that he brings up and reiterates that we spoke about a couple podcasts ago was the idea of attention. And he had this really interesting quote that said, attentional dominance lateralizes even more strongly to the right hemisphere than speech does to the left.
Yes. Yeah, in the book he talks about there's 5 different types of human attention. and 4 of them are primarily driven by the right brain. The only one that's really more dominant in the left brain is really highly focused, hyper-focused, detailed attention, short-term detailed attention. And so attention, especially in that right brain, in that right parietal lobe and frontal lobe. But we know if you get a stroke in the right side of your brain, you no longer will pay attention to the left side of the world. You literally, your attention system is cut in half. And that's called neglect syndrome, right? So that's an alteration of attention. And it could affect your visual system, so you visually only see. Literally, if you, in neuropsychology, if we have people draw, let's say, a clock, they'll only draw the right side of the clock. Or they draw a house, and they'll literally only draw the right side of the house. I mean, these are real things. This is what we've documented that. And that's when people have strokes into the right parietal lobe. It doesn't happen on the left side. It only happens on the right. And it could be motor neglect, where you don't really move the arm on the left side or the body, or it could be what we call alien hand syndrome, or loss of body ownership, because, again, the idea of interoception is related to what we call body ownership. So at a certain point, around 2 years, a child recognizes themselves in the mirror, that right insula is really kicked in fully, and the child says, oh, this is my body. Right, this is me. I'm a separate individual from other people, from my parents, and I have ownership. And we know that if you have a stroke in that area of the brain, you will lose ownership of the left side of your body. And we also know that if somebody touches you, you can then regain ownership, meaning all of a sudden somebody touches you and you go, oh, that's my arm, right? Some people may continue to deny it's that arm. But they're all intimately related, and we know that, again, this happens when you have a stroke in the right side of the brain. It doesn't happen on the left side of the brain.
And one of the cell groups that we're talking about are these mirror neurons, the von Economo cells, that allow us to have this monkey see, monkey do aspect. And so we know with many of the children on the spectrum, they have a difficulty with even mirror recognition. Or you ask them, their parents, if do they recognize themselves in a picture, and they won't point to themselves in a picture. They may say mom, but they won't recognize mom in a picture as well.
Yeah, and they may not know pronouns. They may not know I, me, he, she, because they are not embodied, right? They have to be embodied. We have to be an embodied self, and that is part of the body ownership, and then we can have agency. Then we can control our actions. And so, when you go back and talk about the mirror neuron system and von Economo cells, so when we talk about theory of mind, that's often related to a test that they did with kids to look at kids on the autism, or to be able to identify that there was a certain point where 4-year-old children understand the concept of like basically lying, right? Or, not telling the truth. And that concept, they use different things with dolls and everything to get that. And a child doesn't really understand that concept until around 4. That's when the von Economo cells kick in, right? So the von Economo cells, which their main concentration is that right insula, the 30% more on the right side in the insula and anterior cingulate. Those 2 areas is where we become self-aware. That's where we become embodied. And that is when we're now able to understand other people's ideas and thoughts, and that other people might even lie to us and fool us, right? And that we can fool other people. So now the agency of like, oh, I can actually manipulate my world, and I can manipulate other people. And that's with the evolution of those von Economo cells, which, again, only humans in the highest level of primates have in their brain.
So connecting the dots for our listeners, when we don't see this development of these regions of the brain and these cells maturing, we're really going back to the fact that, 1, we're probably seeing a child that has retained primitive reflex. 2, more than likely they're going to have low muscle tone. And 3, more than likely they're going to have underdeveloped vestibular system, and especially maybe the muscle tone from the left side of the body feeding into the cerebellum and the brainstem on that side, that's going to obviously activate the contralateral side.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all of that kind of relates, as we said, to the development of the brain, which we went through kind of last time, talking about the right and left brain and how it develops and its relationship to movement, muscle tone, muscle, symmetry and asymmetry, and the retained primitive reflexes. So all of that is happening. And again, in the first 3 years, when the right brain is developing, that's when we're really connecting to our body. That's when we're feeling it. That's when proprioception. So interoception and proprioception, the ability to know where our body is, to get a map of our body, to understand that, we have a body and we know where it is. If you read books by non-speaking autistic people, there's one book that I love called Ito from Autism Land. And in it, he talks about how unless he's looking at his arms and his legs, he doesn't know where it is. And that he talks about his body feels like he's underwater with no tongue. We have other kids that tell us they don't feel their tongue, and that's why they can't speak. And the main reason I believe that many kids on the spectrum that don't speak, it's not because of a left brain verbal problem, right? It's not Broca's or Wernicke's areas that's deficient. It's the opposite. It's the right side of the brain. It's the insula. It's the parietal lobe. It's the fact that they don't feel their body. They can't control their body. And so, all of that is developing in that first 3 years, and that's where the right brain takes the lead. And we connect with our own body, and then we connect with other people. And that's attachment. So also, any sort of attachment disorder, attachment is a right brain thing. Attachment disorders are usually more related to, something that's impairing that right brain development.
Well, Iain McGilchrist agrees with you because he has a chapter in his book called What Schizophrenia and Autism Can Tell Us. And it's really all about the different dysfunctions that we see in the right side of the brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And that's the thing. When I read his book, initially I loved it because, here's a classically trained, Oxford or Cambridge, I forget which one, I'm thinking maybe Cambridge, trained, psychiatrist. And the whole book is about brain asymmetry and its relationship to mental health issues. And he was talking about schizophrenia as a right brain deficit. He was talking about autism as a right brain deficit. He's talking about anorexia as a right brain deficit. Talking about depression as a left brain deficit. And it just resonated with me because, and I understood because he's using the same scientific references that I wrote, because I wrote about this in 2004. So, I wrote about this before he ever wrote about it, but our books are very similar. But I think it's just, it's great, obviously, having, again, a classically trained, psychiatrist that, the traditional psychiatrist or medical doctor would never really relate to the right and left brain. And to have him do that at the highest level I just thought really cool.
Yeah. I mean, here's a direct quote. Right hemisphere damaged subjects demonstrate impairments in the sense of unity and integrity of the body. Fragmentation of body awareness, is associated with the right hemisphere, especially the right frontal dysfunction. They have impairments in perceiving and recognizing bodies and bodily movements, indeed biological motion of any kind, and can't exhibit a startling inability to recognize, or can exhibit a startling inability to recognize in their own face parts of their own bodies or their body as a whole.
Yeah, so the loss of body ownership. And so the thing is that when you look at these research on brain lesions, which, there's a lot, years and years and decades of that, that we have to think about it from a developmental perspective. So there's one thing with damaging an area of the brain, and there's another thing where that area of the brain doesn't develop. Or if one side of the brain is overly active and it literally shuts down the other side. So that's our contribution. That's my contribution, is understanding that, you look at that and you say, okay, yeah, so that's a lesion in the right side of the brain or the right parietal or frontal lobe, and people lose body ownership because you damage that insula. But what if that insula doesn't develop? And what if the left insula is so strong that it actually is inhibiting that right side? So it's literally preventing it from developing and shutting it off. It's going to present in the same way as it would if you had a lesion in that side of the brain. But there's no lesion, and that's the thing. When you look at the brain, it looks perfectly normal. Everything looks okay. And when we look at it, we see differences in brain waves and immaturity, and that's where, it's not as obvious to measure that, but it's the same thing. If it doesn't develop over if it's injured afterwards, you're going to get similar results.
Sure. And what I found was fascinating about the choice of the chapter was the fact that the early definitions of autism were actually very compatible to schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually some of the terminology they used in the early 1900s.
Sure, and schizoaffective and that type thing being related and overlapping, like Asperger's syndrome and things of that nature. Yes, and that's the thing. You'll never hear somebody, and you look at schizophrenia and you look at, okay, well, what are some of the symptoms that everybody knows of? Well, basically, the definition of schizophrenia is loss of touch with reality, right? So that's what psychosis means. Psychosis means that you've lost touch with reality. Where is reality in our brain? Well, we do what's called reality testing in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's where we do what's called reality testing. So in our brain, there's a part of our brain that's always saying, is this real or not? Right? Is this fake or not? We know that the left brain likes the virtual world. So the left dorsolateral is more about creating virtual images or abstract images of reality. Like numbers and symbols and things like that, right? They're not, like words are not, like the word tree is not a tree. It's a symbol of a tree. So it's an abstraction of a tree. And that is in the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. In the right, we're actually saying, is this real or not? So if you have a deficit or delay in the right brain or injury in the right brain, or if the left brain is too active, you lose touch with reality or the ability to judge it as real, and you are drawn to living in a virtual world. And so that's what we see, and that is what's happening in schizophrenia and psychosis. And then we also know that in the left temporal lobe, right, in the verbal areas of our brain is where we generate our own voice and where we recognize our own voice. And most of us have 2 or 3 different voices that we use. We don't think about it that way, right? We have a voice that, like if you're reading a book, in your head, you're using your voice and you're reading with one voice. If you're talking to yourself casually, you're using a different voice. If you're doing something else, you may use another voice. So, or if you're like rehearsing what you're going to say to somebody else in your head. So all of us have kind of different voices that we may use at different times. But if you have somebody that's so disconnected from their body that they don't really aren't connected with their body, they don't even know what their own voice sounds like. They also, it may not be coming from inside of their head. It may be coming from somewhere else. And they, have lost touch with reality. And so now they may hear other voices talking to them. They may hear multiple voices talking to them. And there's an area when there's overactivity or seizure activity in the temporal lobe where people will get very religious and hear God. And, not that there aren't people out there that really hear God and that God doesn't talk to you. But we know that if you stimulate that area of the brain, people get very religious. And so, this is what we tend to see in schizophrenia, that you get these. So, and the definition of schizophrenia is if you have psychosis for 6 months or more, essentially that's schizophrenia. And there are different types, as positive and negative symptoms, and we understand that. But essentially the core thing of what we're talking about, the point is we can explain it perfectly just by understanding the neuroanatomy and the networks in the brain.
And to your point, I believe the most important thing to understand, especially in the world that we're living right now, is the idea that if one side gets just so much stronger in functionality, the underdevelopment and the suppressiveness to the other side, and that with the hope of your work and that you've been doing is that by stimulating the underactive side, we're trying to slow down the overactiveness of this side. Okay, in the autism population being that left side, or that OCD population, or the tics, we're not going to take away their gifts. We're not going to take away the strengths of that side. What we're doing is slowing it down enough so they don't have these ongoing symptoms that prevent them from reaching their potential.
Exactly, because all of these functions are good functions. for us to be able to read and understand words and math, we need to be able to abstract things. We need to be able to go into a virtual world. We need to be able to read a map, which is a virtual representation of an actual world, right? There are other times when we need to be in the world. We need to be in reality. We need to, be in nature or whatever. And so they're all functions that play a role, a very important role. But the problem comes into when there's too much emphasis of one, and you can't get out of it. We need to have flexibility in the brain. And what we know is that, especially with people that are very strong left brain, that they lack mental flexibility.
And that flexibility comes from the right hemisphere.
They're very concrete. They're very, rigid, and this is it. And that's why, we get kids that they don't want to transition to something new, or if somebody moves something in their room, they freak out, or if their parents drive a different way to go somewhere, they may flip out in the back seat. They feel very anxious. I just did a podcast interview with a guy who says I think he called himself like the Asperger's guy, really nice guy, and he was telling me that when he goes to go on a plane and go to a different country, and he goes into a different airport that he's not familiar with, he freaks out and he gets a lot of anxiety. But he's learned how to work through that, and he loves being in a new country or whatever. But getting there and coming out of his comfort zone, because the left brain likes its comfort zone. The left brain loves familiarity. It likes to do the same thing over. It likes patterns. Yep. It's very concrete in its thinking, and it's goal directed. So as a goal, this is what I want right now, and I'm going to go after that goal. And it's structured, and it's linear, and it's logical, and it doesn't really care that much about other people. It doesn't really connect to our own body feelings very much. And it's it's going to be aggressive. And anger, as Iain McGilchrist talks about, he said, the left brain, the only pure emotion of the left brain that the right brain can't do is anger. And so, he's looking at it philosophically, saying we're moving more and more towards left brain society. Everything is driving that left brain. We're seeing more and more of these right brain illnesses like psychosis and schizophrenia and autism and ADHD and attachment disorders and anorexia, and all of these things are happening more and more and more and more because society as a whole and technology is driving that left brain so much more when, as he says, the right brain should be the master. I tell people, parents, the right brain develops first for a reason, and it should dominate over the left when the left brain comes on. Because again, the left brain doesn't really have a social awareness. It doesn't really have a conscience. It's not really moral. It's really kind of more egotistical. It's more single, self-interest. It's more, we need to get a goal. We're going to do this, and we want this. It's more materialistic. It's more aggressive. All things that we need to be able to survive. But that needs to be dampened. That needs to be regulated, and the right brain should dominate and then have that. And as the left brain comes up, the right brain then influences it. Don't do that because it's not socially correct. Don't pick your nose. People are going to look at you. Don't push somebody. You're going to hurt them. Or don't jump off that refrigerator. You're going to break your neck. So the right brain is like the parent, knowing, okay, let's be safe, let's be cautious, let's make sure we get along with other people, let's not break any of those rules, let's make sure our body is healthy, let's make sure we take care of nature, all of that is happening, and the left brain doesn't care about any of that, really. And so, but they work together in this relationship that way, with the right brain should be the master. But now, as Iain McGilchrist really says very well in his book, is that because of through the development of Western civilization and now technology and reading books and now computers, and we're moving all towards the left brain. And so now the left brain is becoming the master, which he actually relates that to the usurper, right? So he talks about the left brain is usurping the master, which should be the right brain. And this is where we're so politically divided, and, so much anger, and there's so much hatred in the world, and people are so divided in their camps individually, and that's how the left brain wants to be. The left brain wants to be individual country, individual groups, and individual parties and whatever, and the right brain wants everybody to get together and all get along well, right?
And I think you did a wonderful job in the book, The Master and Emissary. That was the first book that he really laid all this out in 2009, and in the new book now. So for our listeners out there, again, if you want to question the idea that brain asymmetry is not a real thing, or it's just these simple elements that everybody have made these lists for, that it's a far more complex relationship, that we have almost 1,500 pages of material by McGilchrist that tells us otherwise, and that it supports where you're coming from, what you've been saying all along. The only difference is that you're not necessarily talking about lesional problems. You're talking about developmental steps that ultimately eventually could potentially lead to these larger lesions that happen in adulthood, or the adult does have a brain injury, or sometimes traumatic brain injury or concussion that causes a hardcore lesion. But for the majority of our adults that are dealing with adult psychiatric problems, it really comes back down to the fact that they probably had this brain imbalance that started early on, developmentally, could have started early on in the womb, or right there within the first year or so, and then was not picked up.
Right. Yeah, because people don't know this stuff, right? So this is the thing. The average doctor, the average clinician doesn't know what we're talking about, right? And that's why I love that Iain McGilchrist, because he's a clinician. And that's another thing. He's seen a lot of patients, and he's seen this in the patients. So this is one of the reasons why we want to do this podcast, because there are out there, like if we put a post out, or I put a post out, or throughout the years, I may get attacked or criticized by people, and they're saying things like, oh, again, that right-left brain thing is a myth and doesn't exist, and this is disproven, and there's this neuroscientist that will say that, and whatever. And we want to use this as a platform to really argue against that, right? Because it's not the place to do it. I'm not going to go back and argue this on social media.
Yeah.
This is the place where we can say, no, that I'm going to tell you. Anybody, in my mind, anybody who says that brain asymmetry or right and left brain doesn't exist, they don't know what they're talking about. And neuroscientists, they don't know. Many of them specialize in certain areas of neuroscience, or they're doing like computer models. They don't work with live people and patients. So they don't see behaviorally what we see. They don't see how it shows up in a disorder or a disease. They're looking at a computer model, or they're looking at a mouse, or they're looking at a brain, or they're looking at different biochemical factors, or they're looking at a neurotransmitter system, or they're looking at receptors, or they're looking at MRIs. They're not seeing real people. They're not seeing people. They're not seeing how it affects behavior, and they're not recognizing, where these deficits may be. So just because a neuroscientist may say, oh, I don't believe in the right brain, left brain, doesn't mean that that's Bible or gospel or anything. To me, I don't think they know what they're talking about. I know they don't know what they're talking about. That's the whole point of functional neuroscience. And that's where, I have multiple degrees, and one of them is in cognitive neuroscience and neuropsychology. But I'm also, I have a foundation as a clinician and as a chiropractor with a specialty in neurology and nutrition and functional medicine for many, many years. And you do too. You have all that same background for the most part. And so, this is where we want to really set the record straight. And I'd love to, anybody wants to debate me on it. And again, I'm not going to argue with you about you in social media, but I'm telling you, if you say anywhere, respond to me anywhere on my social media that the right and left brain thing is a myth, in my mind, I'm just going to say you're an idiot. That's what I say. I'm sorry. I'm not going to say it to you in person. But in my mind, know that when I read that, I go, this person's a freaking idiot. They don't know what they're talking about. And I'm not even going to waste my time arguing with them. But just, if you just read my book or read all of Iain's books. Read
Alan Shore's book.
I have 4,000 references in my paper. Iain McGilchrist it's an 800-page book, and he has even as many references as I have.
That's just volume one.
That's just volume one, right?
Volume two is
his other book was 700 pages. Now he has two 800-page volumes. But again, the right and left brain thing must be a myth. He just in the last few years wrote these 1,600 pages, but I guess it doesn't really exist.
And I sent you, like last week, we were texting back and forth, and I sent you a picture of our one buddy, Lou Cozolino, his fourth book out that came out on the neuroscience of psychotherapy. And the whole book is all about brain asymmetry.
Right.
Okay. So when you take people like that group, the interpersonal neurobiology group that Alan Shore is a part of, and Lou Cozolino and Dan Siegel and Stephen Porges, and you got some of the biggest names in that arena publishing books, and fourth, fifth generations of their books. You combine Iain McGilchrist's work over the last 20 years. How are we going to debate what you've been trying to say to the world now for 30 years?
Yeah.
That
And part of the problem is it's almost like in science, which really shouldn't be in science, but it's almost like a political correctness. At this point, if you're in like a mainstream lab or at a major university, you're probably never going to hear somebody in a neurobiology or in neuroscience talk about the right and left brain, right? Because it's not cool, or it's looked down upon, or it's not considered as sophisticated. And a lot of that is driven, I think, by the research, because a lot of it is looking for drugs, and it's looking for biochemistry, and it's looking at things that can alter. So all of the research now is really looking more at genetics and looking at biochemistry, because, let's face it, it's a pharma-driven world, and that's where most of the research is going. So they're looking for, what chemical or what hormone can we do? And they look at it that way. But when you really get people that look at brain research and look at the way the brain works and looks at it as a relationship to behavior, and especially as a clinician, we're not looking at it that way. And we know that this exists, but, that's why a lot of people are afraid to go out there, because they think, well, I'm going to be looked down upon, or my other colleagues are going to frown on me because that's an old model. But it really is, it's not true at all. It's actually the most sophisticated models. And that's where someone like Iain McGilchrist is really, he knows his stuff. He's going to come out. That's Lou Cozolino, Dan Siegel, everybody that really is more in the brain asymmetry world. And that's me. I mean, I'm not afraid. I'll talk to anybody about it. I'll go toe to toe with anybody. And I know what's right.
And maybe all us clinicians are all right brain dominant, and all those PhD people are left brain dominant. They're looking at everything from the parts, and we're looking at everything from the whole.
Exactly, which proves that there's a right brain and left brain dominant style, cognitive style, but yet people that are left brain dominant would tell you that there's no such thing, because they don't recognize that because that's the thing, people that are really left brain dominant, they lack self-awareness, right? So that right brain self-awareness, they don't have it. So they're very intelligent, they're very smart, and they've been told they've been gifted their whole life or whatever, but they don't understand what, their own deficits or fallacies, or how they're not doing well, like in the social world or in the, in the other world, because they lack self-awareness. So they'll believe like, okay, well, this is, I don't have a cognitive style, even though it's obvious to everybody else that you do.
Yeah, because, in one of the early pages of the book, Iain talks about that. If you've been a clinician for any time, you know that there is a brain asymmetry to personality, and you can see all these different asymmetrical functions in that patient. And the other thing about the left brain is that the left brain is about confabulation. So
that's right. It's about filling things in. It's about making things up that don't exist. But yeah, so it's funny, because once someone really kind of relaxes and accepts, and that's the thing I hear all the time, and with my book and with most of the things, is that parents will say, I read your book, and going through the right and brain list, oh my God, it spoke about my child or me in a way. It finally explains it. It made so much sense. And that's the point. People are not stupid.
Yeah.
And the reason why I have a third edition is because when people read that book, it resonates, and it explains them and their child, and explains behavior, because it's real and it's true and it's accurate and it's incredibly reproducible, right? And now you can't measure any of that in brain asymmetry with that accuracy, but it's there and it exists, and that's where people gravitate towards it. And if anybody's doing it for any length of time, I remember my sister-in-law, who was taking one of my courses, and she was getting her master's in social work, and she was taking one of my courses, and I was doing some coaching, and she started getting really into the right and left brain thing, because once you start doing that, you won't stop, right? And my brother-in-law, I saw him at a party, and he said to me, "You're killing me." I said, "Why?" He goes, "You're teaching my wife all this right and left brain stuff, and now she's constantly analyzing me." And she's like, "Oh, you're so left brain dominant, and that's why you're doing it, and you don't have a right brain, and that's why you lack any sort of understanding." And so, but once you start doing it, it fits so well, you can't stop.
Yeah.
So everybody around me, I mean, my family, everybody in my office, I mean, that's all we're doing every day, all day. This is right brain, this is left brain, they're right brain dominant, or they have a right brain deficit or left brain deficit. And we get even more specific. And as we talked about, and we can talk about it in another podcast, I've actually broken it down to at least six different subtypes of right brain dominance and left brain dominance. So it correlates with the different types of personality traits that we know that are in some of the other personality, testing and things like that. So, but the fact is, it's there, it's real. You start looking at it, you start using it, and you're not going to stop. And I hope more and more people do that because, we've got to change this perception that there's a myth of the right and left brain, because I'm telling you, if you want to help anybody in the mental health world, or you want to explain anything, like Iain McGilchrist, he quotes this famous neuroscientist who he describes as a skeptical neuroscientist, Tim Brown. And it's one of my favorite quotes from his first book. And Tim Brown was quoted as saying that nothing in human psychology or psychiatry makes sense except in light of brain asymmetry. If you want to understand mental health, you can only understand it if you look at it from a right and left brain perspective. If you don't, it will never make sense, and you're never going to be able to really change it in any substantial way. That's why this is important.
Yeah, so for our listeners out there, again, you can start out by first getting a hold of Dr. Melillo's old textbook, the 2004 book. Get your hands on the most recent Disconnected Kids. His research papers are available on his website, and we should maybe on the next podcast get into that paper that you and your son wrote with Dr. Leisman and your group on the two sides of brain asymmetry in autism, and really where you delve into even the nuances, the specific nuances that are seen between the left and right brain. And if you want, go check out Iain McGilchrist. We highly recommend that you check out his books, because this is real. We didn't make this up. There's 200 plus years of research and that's been done to support the idea that we know the brain is asymmetrical, and that when it comes out of balance, we're going to see these different developmental disorders and that eventually the adult disorders.
Absolutely. If you want to help yourself, if you want to help your kids or anybody close to you, you only be able to help if you understand this. And most people, the one organ they understand the least amount about is their own brain. Most people have no idea. Are they a right brain or left brain dominant person? That's one of the first things you should figure out. And in my book, Autism, The Scientific Truth, I have an adult checklist that I've created that is a way of figuring out what we call your cognitive style. How do you view the world? Are you a little bit more right brain or left brain? Are you, pretty mixed? Or are you really strongly one way or the other? Just like being right-handed or left-handed. And one isn't better than the other. We're not criticizing one versus the other. It's just, that's the way it is, and that's the way it works. And, until you really understand your own brain, you're never going to be able to help yourself. So, delve into that, look into it, and I think you'll find it fascinating.
Well, again, it's always a pleasure getting to rap with you, and we continue doing this. I'm having a blast.
Yeah, no, this is great. All right, we'll see you all again soon down the road.